Welcome to another video. Today I'm gonna review how pieces capture the other pieces. So be ready and let's go. Here we want to take all black pieces, but there are some conditions. Just white pieces can move, and we have to avoid the squares that they are controlled by black pieces. So as you know, this rook can control this file and this rank, and this knight can control these 8 squares, and this pawn can control these 2 squares. So in first move we have to avoid to go to red squares. So if we want to take this rook by our bishop or by our knight, this knight can take us. So in first move we cannot take the rook. From other hand, if we want to take this pawn by our bishop, this knight can take our bishop. So in first move we cannot take the rook and we cannot take the pawn. What about knight? If we take the knight, nobody can take us. So first move should be pawn taking the knight. So here nobody can take our pieces. In second move, if we want to take this pawn with our bishop, this rook can take us. So in second move we cannot take the pawn. So what about the rook? Easily we can take the rook, and finally we can take the pawn. Here and in second move, if we want to take the rook with our bishop, it is possible, but to taking the pawn we have to turn back to our first square, and then we have to take the pawn. So it will take more moves. So the better way is taking the rook by our knight and finally taking the pawn with our bishop, as here we are looking for the quickest way to capture all black pieces. Here we have the same concept. Just white can move, and we have to avoid the squares that they are controlled by black pieces. So as you know, this pawn can control these 2 squares, this pawn can control these 2 squares, and this knight can control these 3 squares. So we have to avoid to go to red squares. So the quickest way is taking the knight and then taking the pawn. So first of all, we can move our knight from the way of our rook, and then in next move we can take the knight by our rook, and after that easily we can taking the pawns. Same concept. We want to take all black pieces. Just white can move. We have to avoid the squares that they are controlled by black pieces. As you know, this bishop can control this diagonal and this diagonal, and this knight can control these 8 squares, and this pawn can control these 2 squares. So first of all, we cannot take the knight as it is controlled by the bishop, and we cannot go to the red squares. So the quickest way is king to g4 and taking the pawn, and then taking the bishop, and finally taking the knight. Here we want to take all black pieces. The same concept. Just white pieces can move, and we have to avoid the squares that they are controlled by black pieces. As you know, this rook can control this file and this rank, and this rook can control this file and this rank, and this pawn can control these two squares. So we have to avoid to go to red squares. So first of all, if we take this rook by our pawn, so in next move we cannot go to g7 because it will block, and we cannot take this rook by our pawn. So the only way to take this rook is taking that by our f4 pawn. But right now we cannot take it. So how we can take all black pieces? So the only way is taking g5 rook by our h pawn. So first of all, we can go to h4 and taking this rook by our h pawn, and then attacking to e6 and taking this rook by our pawn, and next going to e7 and going to e8 and change this pawn to knight, and finally taking this pawn by our knight. Here we want to take the black pawn, but the condition is a little bit different. Here the black can move as well. As you know, we cannot take this pawn by our pawn as they are in the same file. So the only way to take this pawn is by our bishop. Second, as black can move as well, so if we allow this pawn to move, so we cannot take it anymore with our bishop, because our bishop can control just white squares. So if we allow this pawn to move, we cannot take it anymore by our bishop. So how we can take it? The only way is we have to block it by our pawn first. So the only way to block this pawn is going to d4 by our pawn. In that case, we will block that pawn from moving, and then we can take it by our bishop. So next move by black can be king g7, and then we can attack this pawn by our bishop. So we will go to a2. Next move black can come to f6, and finally we can take this pawn by our bishop. Here we want to take the black queen. As a rule in chess, when the king will be in danger, so we cannot move any other pieces. So the only way to take or win this queen is attack to the king by our bishop in f5, and here black cannot move any other pieces. So the only way is taking this bishop or to take this king out of control of bishop. So we can take this bishop, and then easily we can take the queen. Or in next move, this king can go to another square like f6, and here easily we can take the queen. Here we want to win the black rook. As it is in white square, so we cannot attack the rook by our bishop. And as the king is a little bit far away, so we cannot attack the rook by our king easily. So the quickest way is attacking the rook by our knight. So we can go to b4, and right now we are attacking to this rook. So in next move, black can, for example, go to a1. in this case, as black rook went to black square, so here we can attack it by our bishop. Here the bishop is attacking to king and in the same time to the rook. So as I told you, as rule in chess, right now we cannot move any other pieces. So next move, this king can go to, for example, g6, and here easily we can take the rook. So suppose this rook can go somewhere else, for example b2. Here once again we can attack both of king and rook in the same time. So next move, for example, this king going to f7. Next move, we can take the rook. Next case, suppose this rook going to c2. Easily next move we can take it by our knight. Another case, suppose this rook going to d2. Here once again easily we can take it by our bishop. Next case, if we go to any of these three squares, easily we can take it by our king. So suppose we will go to g2. Easily we can take it by our king. And finally, if we go to h2, here once again easily we can take it by our bishop. Here we want to win the black bishop. As you know, this bishop can escape and control the black squares. So it can go and control to this diagonal and this diagonal. So first of all, if we attack this bishop by our king, easily it can escape. So how we can first of all control these four squares and then attack to the bishop? As you know, the easiest way and the only way is control these four squares by our knight. So as you know here, this knight can control these four squares. And then easily we can attack to this bishop. So in next move, black can move, for example, king to b8, and then we can attack the bishop. For example, if this bishop going to h6, easily we can take it. Or if it go to g7, once again we can take it. Or suppose going to e7, once again we can take it by our knight or by our king. And finally, suppose this bishop going to d6, once again we can take it by our knight. Here we want to win the black queen. So as you know, this king cannot go to these two squares as they are beside our king. From other hand, the black cannot move its queen. So the only pieces black can move in first move is these 2 pawns. So these 2 pawns can go 1 square forward. So the only way to take the queen is moving this pawn. So in that case, we will block this pawn. So right now, the only way is moving this pawn. So suppose black move this pawn 1 square. Here easily we can attack the queen. So in next move, if black take our bishop, easily we can take it. Suppose black take this pawn forward. So once again we can take the queen. Suppose this queen coming here. So once again, easily we can take it by our bishop or by our pawn. Suppose in first move, this pawn will take this pawn. Once again, easily we can attack. So same scenario. If it take it by queen, we will take the queen by our king. Or black move this pawn, we can once again take the queen. Here we want to win the bishop. As you know, king is moving just one square at a time. So the easiest and the quickest way is attacking and taking this bishop by our rook. So first of all, we can attack the king. As you know, the king should move. For example, going to e7. Once again, we can attack both king and bishop in the same time. So as a rule, we have to move the king. So suppose it will go to d6. So easily we can take this bishop. Here we want to win the queen. So the easiest way is first of all attacking to the king by our pawn. So we will go to c4, and as you know, we are attacking to the king. And as a rule in chess, we have to move or we have to take this pawn. For example, the king will take c4 pawn, and then we can take the queen by our bishop. Or if the king going to somewhere else like b4, once again we can take the queen. Here we want to win the black rook. So the easiest way is going to a8 by our rook. And here if black taking our pawn, easily we can attack the king. And as a rule in chess, the king should go out of our rook control. So for example, king to b7. Here easily we can take the rook. So here suppose black not taking our pawn. For example, king to b7 and attacking to our rook. Here easily we can take our pawn to h8 and change it to queen. So here the king cannot take our rook as it is protected by our rook. For example, if black taking our queen, easily we can take it back by our rook. So this is all about capturing the pieces. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel and share it with your friends. See you in next video.